And we are live. So I am here today with Taylor Pearson, the author of The End of Jobs. Thank you, Taylor, so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, I'm excited. This will be fun.
I'm so excited as well. So I understand that you created a book about a year ago, and it was called The End of Jobs. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So it's kind of a brief history of contemporary careers is the tagline I've been using lately. But the idea behind the book is basically that um, over the last 500 years, we've moved through distinct economic periods. We've moved from an agricultural to an industrial period, right? Everyone went from living on farms to living in cities and working primarily in factories and manufacturing. We went from a industrial economy to a knowledge economy, right? People used to work on production lines, and now most people work in kind of office knowledge work type jobs. And then the argument of the book is we're actually at this kind of transition point to the next phase, which is from what you might call the knowledge economy to the entrepreneurial economy. And so the first half of the book is kind of why that's happening, how to think about it, some ways to think about it. And the second half of the book is ways you can kind of adapt your career and the way you think about your career to an entrepreneurial economy.
Hmm. And how did you yourself get involved in writing this book?
So I was a marketing manager for a small e-commerce company based out of San Diego
Hmm.
for about 2 years. And the two guys that owned that company also had they had founded uh, basically a community forum and event business for online entrepreneurs, internet-based businesses. And so I got involved in that community through them um, and became a big part of it. And so I started seeing the actual kind of inception moment for the book is they host a conference every year in Bangkok. And I was at the conference in Bangkok and we were sitting around and we were kind of talking. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee originally. One of the guys is from a small town in Pennsylvania. Another guy is from a small town or a suburb about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. And we were talking about how do we explain this to our friends that we're sitting at this hotel in Bangkok and we have these like little businesses which are based on this technology called the internet and software, and that in the same way people understand certain career scripts, right? Like you understand kind of the lawyer career script and the doctor career script. If you want to be a doctor, you kind of know what to do. You take this major, you get this GPA, you take this test, you get the score, and that career script is what you might call legible. It's kind of
Hmm.
clear how you follow it. And so the mapping out of the book was how do we explain, or how do I explain this alternate career script? There's another
Hmm.
way to approach your career um, that you probably, unless you grew up in very particular parts of the country or in very particular groups, you didn't even know was possible. I certainly didn't know it was possible
Hmm.
until pretty late.
Hmm. What led you personally to take an alternate career path?
The inflection point for me was I did a study abroad in Argentina when I was in college. I was a
Hmm.
history major, and my dad uh, sort of pleaded, sort of insisted that I have some marketable skill when I graduate, something other than just history. And so I also I studied Spanish as well. And I got basically 2 years into my Spanish career and realized I was terrible at Spanish. And the only way I was going to get any good enough to be able to use it professionally was to just move somewhere and just live with people that spoke Spanish all day until I could finally do it. And so I did that, and I lived in Argentina for about 6 months, studied at a university there, and kind of broadened my horizons, to use a cliche. But I saw all these things that I didn't know you could do. Right, I didn't know you could, move to other countries and teach English, and I did that for a year after I graduated school initially. But I met all these people just doing different things, and I thought, there's all these possibilities that I didn't realize existed. I wonder if there's even more possibilities that I didn't know existed, and that maybe these two or three options that I thought were kind of the only options, maybe there's actually a lot more to it than that. And so that kind of started the search for me. I was a freelance interpreter for a while. I was an English teacher for a while. And then I got into marketing and internet business stuff from there.
Hmm. I've noticed that seem to pick up on the future of work really easily, but different communities and freelancers tend to understand it because they're meeting people who are in this information technology revolution. So, how would you describe it to a young social entrepreneur? So, we have a few communities tuning in to this broadcast, and one of them is the under 30 changemakers community, and they aren't exactly familiar with the future of work. But for whatever reason, nomads tend to meet a lot of people who are already doing remote work, or they themselves do remote work. So, I know on your website you said that you find meaning through entrepreneurship. How did you personally find meaning through entrepreneurship?
So to your first question, maybe could you give me an example, like an example of something that might be tuning in, just so I can have a sense for how to respond?
Yeah, so under 30 changemakers is mostly young social entrepreneurs under the age of 30, millennials who are creating businesses, possibly in like a landlocked situation where they have to stay on the ground for a period of time to create that work, but they themselves are employers. So what should they expect for the future of work?
Good question. So I'll tackle it from a couple different angles. I think the um, the two kind of big picture trends that are really dominant and that are worth thinking about are uh, technology and more specifically automation and globalization. So I'll kind of start with the globalization angle. If you look at what is going on with education and with access to global markets,
Mm-hmm.
um, from 2000 to 2010, we had the same number of college graduates that we did from the year 2000 to the beginning of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this huge explosion in the number of people who are equipped to do what I described it as knowledge work earlier. And all of a sudden, you also have access to those people from anywhere in the world, right? We're doing this over Google Hangouts. There's technology like voice over IP and Skype that the people I work with on a day-to-day basis in my team. I have one guy that lives in Australia, someone else that lives in Southeast Asia, right? And that's kind of the marketplace. So all of a sudden, you have this hugely competitive global marketplace where everyone has access and people, if you were applying for a job or you're starting a company, well, let me start it from the job angle. If you're applying for a job, all of a sudden you're not competing with people that are in your zip code. You're competing potentially increasingly with people all over the world. And the kind of flip side of this is if you're hiring, it's a great time to be hiring, right? Because now you have access not just to people in your immediate area, but you have access to people all over the world. So that's kind of this globalization angle. To take it from the automation and technology angle, if you look at what happened, say, started in the late 90s, really, maybe even before that, maybe in the late 80s, but we had this huge shift of manufacturing work from the developed West to the developing world, particularly from the US to China is kind of the major shift. And we're now seeing that exact same shift facilitated by technology from kind of this traditional knowledge work that was based in the US. And that's shifting also to the developing world because, right, it's really cheap to reach these people. And I remember being in Europe 10 years ago and trying to make a call back to the US, and you got to buy like the $10 phone card and
Mm-hmm.
like scratch it off and go into the phone booth and call someone, and like half the time it doesn't work. You got to call collect, and like this was this huge thing, and now it's you open your Skype and you connect to the Wi-Fi at the hotel or the hostel you're staying to, and you can call someone for free immediately wherever they are. So all of a sudden, technology has opened up access to this global markets. And the punchline sort of being that if you are someone that is looking to hire, if you're looking to expand, it's this amazing opportunity. And if you're someone that's seeking out kind of already existing opportunities as opposed to creating new ones, it's getting more difficult and more competitive.
How can people stand out as maybe a freelancer in a very competitive global marketplace?
Good question. I guess the thing I always come back to is how can you lean into the fear? There's a great book by Steve Pressfield called The War of Art. That's one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite books.
Mine too.
And he talks about this idea of what he calls the resistance. And I think the opening line of the book, to paraphrase, is something like, we all have two lives, the life we lead and the unlived life within us. And between the two stands the resistance. That there is this force, which he kind of calls the resistance, where we think that the work we think that something terrible is going to happen to us. So the example I always use is there's been this big shift in terms of what is risky and what is safe and how we perceive those things. So if you kind of one of the big findings of evolutionary psychology is that we care a lot about what other people think from us, because it used to be really, really important that if you were in a tribe of 100 people or 150 people and 99% of those people didn't like you, you were kicked out of the tribe, and you wandered around for a few days and then you died. And so
Hmm.
it's really, really important that a lot of people like you if you're in a tribe of 100 people. And the exact opposite is true today, that if you look at any successful freelancer, usually 99% of people don't like their work. It doesn't resonate with them. They think it sucks. And 1% of people really love it. And I think this is just for me. This is exactly what I've wanted. This is unlike all the other mass market stuff out there. And so the people that I see that do really well in those kind of freelance careers are people that have a very distinct and unique voice. And usually the process of developing that voice, in my experience, has been this process of constantly figuring out what is it I'm afraid of, and how can I lean into that.
Hmm. Very cool. I want to get back to the globalization part of the future of work because I think it's really important. So globalization has been expanding trade between nations, but it's also increased the movement of jobs back and forth globally. What are some likely effects of that globalization for the prospects of employment in the future for people who are looking for jobs?
I mean, the obvious effect that I kind of mentioned is that it's going to become a lot more competitive, right? Just
Right.
the number of applicants you're dealing with are going to become much greater. And then kind of my thesis of the book is that it's increasingly getting easier to create your own job than it is to find one that already exists, right? That if you are a freelancer and you have a distinct voice and a distinct style, and you're a mini monopoly, right?
Hmm.
That if you think about Jackson Pollock as an artist or something, he is a monopoly. That if you want to have a Jackson Pollock artwork, you can't go get it from someone else. There's
Hmm.
only one. And that makes him this sort of interesting monopoly. And lots of freelancers are able to do the same thing. They're a designer with a particular design skill, or a particular sense of style, or a content creator, a video producer, whatever it is. But those kind of unique, hated by most, loved by very few types of positions and roles are going to be more and more common and more profitable.
Hmm. I remember you saying in your book that what is risky is going to be safe. And so what could you give me an example of something like that? I feel like it would probably apply to what full employment might look like in the future.
Sure. So the example I give in the book is I kind of pick on accountants a lot, and I pick on accountants mostly because I have a lot of friends that are accountants, and I was trying to explain to them maybe how the accounting career is going to be different over the next 50 years than it has been over the preceding 50 years. So imagine you are an accountant. Um, you're, let's say, 30 years old, you have an accounting degree, you're working in a large corporation, their accounting department. And every year, you get your kind of cost of living raise and things get a little bit better. And this kind of goes on and on and on. And this is, I call this silent risk. That what
Hmm.
happens in a lot of these cases is, you look back over your last 5 years and you're listening to me and you're saying like, this guy's full of it. Everything's been going fine, nothing's happened. And all of a sudden, what happens is you have this big catastrophic event, which is the company realizes that they can hire a team in India and they can replace half their accounting department with people in India, or some guy in Silicon Valley develops software that does 70% of what you do for a fraction of the cost. And that's a lot of those kind of what we think of traditional knowledge work roles are falling prey to one of those two things, either automation and technology or globalization or some combination thereof. Whereas you take someone who, the same guy, he leaves his accounting role to do something which would be perceived as risky. He goes off and he's going to start a career as a freelancer. And he's going to do, let's just say he's going to do design work for the sake of argument. And he sends out 10 design proposals to these 10 people that he thinks might be good for websites, and they all reject him and they say, no, this sucks, your stuff isn't that good and I don't really need this, and yada yada. And the difference there being that all of a sudden he's got market feedback, which is this thing that I was trying isn't helpful, and he can figure that out iteratively and over time. And maybe it's something he starts doing on the weekends, and it's not something he leaves for. But there's this interaction with the marketplace where he can actually learn, iterate, and get better. And the danger of the other situation being, you don't figure out until it's too late, right? You don't, when you're 10 years into your career, you're 35 years old, your only skill is this particular type of accounting in this particular company. And now that's just, it's been outsourced or it's been automated away. And what do you do? Whereas something which feels a lot riskier, which seems a lot more volatile, is actually in the long run a safer position, right? Because now all of a sudden you can adapt to the market feedback.
Mhm. So, personal question.
Sure.
As a millennial, I'm looking at diversifying my income streams. Would you recommend that as a course of action for the future of work?
My experience, what I've seen, I should say, is people tend to get rich with one income stream. They tend to stay rich with multiple ones, which is very early on in a business or very early on in a career. It's very hard to do lots of different things well, right? Because now all of a sudden you spread your energy into 5 different projects. And you're going to do 5 different things at the same time. And so you're going to get outcompeted in each of those 5 different things by one person who's putting all their focus
On
into
one
them.
thing.
And
Okay.
so I guess what I tend to see is people have, one primary means of generating their income, one business, one particular skill set, and they get really, 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 really good at that. And at that point, when they're sort of in this best of class category, that's when they start to diversify into other businesses or other revenue streams or whatever it is.
So, to summarize, master your craft, be very distinct. And anything else you would recommend to a freelancer?
Anything else I would recommend to a freelancer? Make really good stuff.
Make really
It's
good
funny.
stuff.
I come back every time I think about what to do next or what works for me. Inevitably, the solution is just make really good stuff. There's a great talk by Neil Gaiman, the author. I think it's called "Make Great Art" or "Make Good Art." It's a commencement speech he gave, but it's wonderful. If anyone is listening and they like Neil Gaiman or they're looking for inspiration, I would highly recommend it. And it kind of says the same point that the answer is usually to make great art.
Mm-hmm. So, how can millennials best adapt to the changes brought on by the new economy?
What changes specifically?
Changes in the information technology revolution. So, what that might be, it would be something like, will jobs be going away? Will they be looking to, we've kind of already touched on this for like out competing in the market, but what are some strategies that they can use now to adapt to changes? Sorry, so many flies in my face.
No worries. It's a beautiful backdrop. It's worth it. So I kind of 2 strategies that I advocate for. The first is apprenticeships, which is when you're dealing with this kind of entrepreneurial work, one of the ways that people seem to succeed more is instead of going back for kind of traditional education, whether that's an advanced degree or something like that, people end up going to work for more experienced entrepreneurs, more experienced startups and companies, and learning a lot through that. And they're able to parlay those skills into something they can do for themselves. So that's how I got started. That's kind of my story. I was doing some small side projects, and that turned into working as a sort of an SEO consultant or an SEO contractor, and then eventually a marketing manager at a small e-commerce company based in San Diego. And that was what kind of launched my freelance career, that I now had this kind of a flagship client, quote unquote, but basically my employer for 2 years. And I said, hey, here, this company grew by 500% over a 24-month period. And here's what I did for them. And here's how we did it. And if you want, I can come do it for you too. And that was a much more persuasive sales pitch than, I read some articles or I think I'm good at this. I said, here's a track record, which I can kind of publicly show to you. And now there's some real, I guess, meat there, something that's convincing. So apprenticeships is one way. And then the other thing I think is side projects. Part of what has happened because of the IT revolution, right, is the cost of starting up, so to speak. The cost of getting started has gone down dramatically. That, if you wanted to start an e-commerce company, if you want to start a company selling physical products, 20 years ago, the minimum order quantity, or the minimum order in China was, $500,000. The company I worked with, we put in a $50,000 order in 2007. And that was really small for manufacturing in China in 2007. That was a very small purchase order. And now that number is dramatically lower. It's like $5,000 or $3,000. You used to have to go rent a storefront, which cost you, $10,000 a month or $5,000 a month or whatever, just lease at this storefront for 2 years. And now you have to create a Shopify website or a WordPress website, which is going to cost you $20 a month or $50 a month. And so there's possibility of you can start very small, and you can do that on nights, on weekends, on lunch breaks, and gradually build it up into something that's really, really substantial. Is now a very real possibility, where it used to be that the barrier to entry was just so high that you couldn't do that.
Mhm. I want to go back to what you said about apprenticeships, because I think that this is really important for people who are starting out. I saw a post yesterday from Charlie Hohen about he worked for two people who weren't successful at the time, Ramit Sethi and Tim Ferriss, and he worked for them for free. And he was able to build a really great relationship with them, and then they later hired him. What are your thoughts on free work?
So actually, Charlie has a TED Talk on that, which I think he did in like 2011. I actually watched the talk, and that was a lot of what inspired me to do what I did. I like free work. I think it's tricky a lot of times. Like I get, I don't know, maybe an offer a week for free work on average. And the problem is, if you're asking someone to do free work for them, one of the fundamental misunderstandings I see is like, they don't realize, people that email me don't realize how much work it is for me to give them the work. Like I've got to explain to them the context of the business. I've got to explain to them how to do this task. And a lot of times, like, it's going to take me 2 hours to explain it to them, and I can just do it in 2 hours. So like, I'll just do it. So I think like the times where I've seen it work really well is someone that is really done a lot to understand exactly how the other business operates and exactly what kind of possibilities or what kind of work it needs to be done. If you look at he has published his original emails to both Ramit and Tim, I think. And he says, I think something specific like, hi, I worked with X person to create a membership site. Here's the benefits of the membership site. Here's the current status of your business model. Here's why I think adding a membership site to your business model will be beneficial. We can do it with this software. It's going to take me 2 weeks. It's going to cost $200. Would you like me to go? Say yes, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, obviously there's that deep understanding. So I think if you have that sort of understanding of it, then it's very viable. But it's I say, maybe 1 in 50 pitches that I see have that depth of understanding, because it takes, right, you got to follow the person for 6 months or a year to understand their business and understand what they're doing well enough. The other thing I see that works really well, and this was something I did, is using that strategy with maybe people you don't follow online. Like the first free work gig I got was with a small digital marketing agency in Memphis, Tennessee, which is where I'm from. And like, they didn't get a lot of pitches, right? Like not many people Google digital agency, my city, and so at least not in Memphis, and sent them kind of, hey, I taught myself some SEO stuff and I'll come do it for you for free. So picking somewhere where you can still learn really valuable skills that maybe isn't as someone that's not going to get a lot of those other offers can be a good stepping stone or a good leverage point.
Mm-hmm. So I want to step back to questions on economics. So how is the information revolution and globalization modifying the foundations and changing the ground rules for prospects of global prosperity? We have a lot of people in our communities tuning in from all parts of the world, and a lot of the times they are tackling issues in the developing world. So what can the future of work provide for nations that are seeing economic growth or need economic growth?
That's a good question. My initial reaction is I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the question. I lived in Vietnam for about a year and a half. So I think you call that the developing world. And I think what I saw there, and generally in Southeast Asia, is the kind of flip side of this is people who are living in those countries where the cost of living is much lower than in kind of developed Western countries have an incredible advantage. I worked in co-working spaces alongside Vietnamese developers and designers and other people that were able to acquire those kind of in-demand technical skills that could be done online or over the internet. And they were able to be much more upwardly mobile, much quicker than other people in those economies, right? Because they could, to go as a developer in Vietnam, for example, $2,000 a month is a very good starting salary for someone in Vietnam, and it's not a very good starting salary for someone with kind of advanced technical skills in the U.S. And so that kind of reverse geo arbitrage was something that a lot of people were doing very well. And I think it's frankly like you really get a sense for how hard those people. And I met people that were developers, and their grandmother grew up in a rice field and seen electricity until she was halfway through her life. And so those kinds of, what took the West 200 years was happening over the course of 2 generations, which is pretty cool, and hopefully will continue.
Yeah, we're looking at huge generational shifts right now. So kind of segueing back into a very different territory, how do you think the relationship of work and family will evolve as people take on more remote work?
In what sense? Do you have a specific?
Like I've been following a few blogs about nomadic families actually that take work online and tend to just go off and travel. But did you personally find that to be true in your research on the end of jobs?
I think there's a pretty long-term trend towards which you might call it divergentism. I borrowed that line from someone else, but if you used to be, everyone was a village, right? And you lived with 150 other people, and those were almost the same family. Like there's some anthropological studies of, I want to say it was New Guinea, I might be wrong, but these tribes where when a woman was pregnant, everyone would have sex with her at the same time, so that no one knew whose child it was. And so there was actually this 150 person tribe where no one really even knew the lineage, and effectively it was all this one family. And then that sort of broke up. If you look at still a lot of the developing world, you might have kind of the larger, I'm not sure, but the larger nuclear family, right? Like the grandmother, the parents, and the children living in one home. And then in most of the, particularly in the U.S., children often live in different cities than their parents. On one side of my family, everyone lives in a different city. There's no one in among 20 relatives, no one lives in the same city. And I think that's probably the direction that it's going. And I think kind of a lot of people bemoan that it's like a really bad thing that families are kind of breaking up and becoming more divergent, but I'm not so sure that's the case. I think it allows for more individualistic expression. And so, yeah, I think that is the way things are going, and you can decide for better or for worse how you feel about it.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious if there's going to be this is just a thought, but co-living families. I'm in a co-living space right now. I live in a co-living space. A lot of my friends live in co-living spaces. So do you think that it might be time to move away from the nuclear family and possibly become shared? This might be unrelated to the future of work, but it is dependent on almost everyone here has a remote job. So do you think it's possible that many more people could be probably co-parenting in the future, especially the millennial generation?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think kind of what the internet let people do is they could organize based on aspects of their identity that they didn't used to be able to. So for example, it was always kind of acceptable that if you lived in a particular geographic area, that you were part of the Memphis civic community, or you organized based on your job, that you were a lawyer and you went to the lawyers conferences and you knew lawyers. But, before the internet, if you liked, a particular genre of manga comics, you couldn't just hang out all the time, but now you can, right? I don't know what the forum is, but I'm sure there's some forum that's, the 19 subgenres of manga comics. Or I got into powerlifting a few years ago, and so I troll through all these powerlifting forums, right? And I don't know anyone in my day-to-day life that's into powerlifting, but I think it's cool that I can hang out on these forums. So I think it would be interesting, and I suspect groups will start to organize are around those ideas in the same geographic spaces, right? So it's like you kind of have this, you share this similar value system, where typically, you lived with your parent, you lived with your family, you lived with people based on kind of arbitrary conditions. And now you can increasingly do that based on your values, right? I suspect the reason you live in the house with the people you do is because you'll have a certain similar worldview and values in terms of how you approach life. But I could be
Yes,
wrong.
that is very true. Yeah, it certainly is true. I mean, I've been living in co-living spaces for the past 4 years. I absolutely love it. But it is a huge extension of working online. So, and the people I meet tend to be working online as well. So I'm curious where it's going to go personally. I have been looking into intergenerational co-living spaces to see if this is something that's going to shift with our generation, because it doesn't seem like it's going away and it seems like it's growing. So
Yeah, I guess the thing I wonder about with families is the financial aspect of it,
right.
like how much, I think my sister lives maybe 10 minutes away from my parents, and like the amount of childcare she would have had to pay for when she was raising her kids, had she not had, her both her in-laws and my parents live near here, and how do you, like what's the structure that comes in to replace that, and also as people get older, there's lots of problems with people that are in their 70s or 80s and basically have no human contact, right? Because they're not built into this social network anymore.
Mhm. Have you personally considered what it's going to be like when you have a family? Do you think that things will change with remote working and things like that?
I don't know. I expect I'll probably travel less. I expect I would spend more time with my family. But I mean, I guess the few people I've seen that are doing both, that are kind of that have location flexibility, they can technically work from wherever they want, whenever they want, with families. I'm kind of surprised by how manageable they make it. I think of I know a couple that has, I want to say like a 5, a 7, and an 8-year old, and they live in Bali, and they like every year or two they'll move. They lived in Argentina for a year or two. I think they were in Singapore, they were in Bali, they were in Brazil. They would just set up shop for a year or two and find a school for their kids that they thought was appropriate, and they've been able to make it work remarkably well. Like I wouldn't have ever expected they could have raised a family, grown the business, and traveled at the same time. But um, I've seen a number of people do it, which is pretty amazing.
Mhm. That is so cool to me.
Yeah.
So Under 30 Changemakers started actually as a support group, and we started to tackle entrepreneurial loneliness. And I've noticed that when people are faced with a lack of structure, it can be extremely hard on their psyche, and they have a hard time, maybe as a leader, not being able to relate to a lot of people or having a lot of people in their peer group. What do you think is going to be shifting for employers in the next generation for tackling mental health issues?
Specifically around entrepreneurial loneliness.
Yes.
Um, I'm not sure employers will deal with it as much as, I think about like it's not a freelancer's clients don't care that he's lonely. I mean, they care if
Hmm.
it impacts his work, and they care because, hopefully they're decent human beings. They care, the people they work with don't have mental health issues.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think co-living is obviously an interesting trend. One of the ways I've dealt with it a lot is just organizing regular meetups. Like I have like a brunch every couple of weeks and a dinner every couple of weeks where just people in the city that are doing similar things that I can, talk about what I'm working on and not have them kind of glaze back at me like I'm crazy, or it's just a weird thing. Those kind of things I find to be really, really helpful. Online mastermind groups I find to be really helpful, having those sort of, this idea of like manga comics, right? Like, I have a group of people that I talk to every 2 weeks, and they all have internet-based publishing businesses, right? And so we talk about what's going on with publishing, what users are working on, and I find those are both helpful from a strategic business, but also just a cathartic. Like, yes, I'm also sitting in my room going crazy because this article is terrible, and I'm beating myself up over it, and you are too, and that makes me feel strangely better about it.
Hmm. So, for loneliness, you should connect and reach out as much as possible. What do people do about lack of structure?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my hack for the loneliness thing has really been like the just putting on my calendar, like every 2 weeks, host a dinner, and then I'll just have a week before. I'll send out invitations, and just making that something I do. Um, it doesn't, nothing organizes itself. Like in the water cooler, moments organize themselves, right? Like if you just show up to the office, you'll show up at the water cooler. Whereas, I find it to be much, much more deliberate about it. I have to actually create those events. And what was your second question?
Creating structure. So maybe for people who are just starting out, how can they kind of ease into the complete lack of structure that is entrepreneurship?
Um, That's a good question. How do you get started creating structure? I guess I'll tell you the things that have been helpful for me. There's a great book called Getting Things Done by David Allen, which I recommend to almost everyone. But it's sort of it's a productivity. How do you manage your life, your to dos, and all the incoming stuff? I found that added a lot of structure to um, how I manage my days. Having the kind of first part of my day scripted out. So I have a pretty set, like the first 2 hours of my day looks pretty much the same. I kind of script out exactly what it looks like. And so having that as a way to sort of get some momentum into the day that, okay, I've stretched and I've done a little exercise, I've done a few things and I get some momentum. And then the other thing that I guess really the main thing that works for me, if I'm being honest, is accountability. So I mentioned I have a couple of kind of peer mastermind groups. And I find what helps me kind of self-impose structure on myself is having someone who we have social capital. So like, I don't want to call John and tell John that, hey, that's the thing I said I was going to do. I just didn't do it. I just like chickened out and didn't do it. Like it's more embarrassing for me to tell John that than to just do the thing. And so invariably I'll just end up doing the thing because I know I got to talk to John on Sunday morning. If I tell John I didn't do the thing, he's going to look at me and he's going to be disappointed. And it's just like, well, I'll just do the thing. So I find having that kind of like external accountability through people I respect saying, hey, I'm going to do this. By the next time we talk, I'm going to have X done. The embarrassment of telling them I didn't do X is more than my ego can handle. And so inevitably I just do X instead.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really good advice. I really struggled with it personally when I first started out. And actually, I found out about it mostly through something called unschooling, which I think is also kind of uh, an outcome of the future of work. It's an alternative schooling path that people can take, but when they take it, you're entirely creating your own curriculum. Very similar to entrepreneurship, but you have to go through something called deinstitutionalization, where you have to create that structure entirely on your own. Like you said, be deliberate about it and create what you need. So we're getting to the end of this interview. I just wanted to ask, has anything changed since you wrote The End of Jobs, and is there anything else you'd want to add to it?
But the biggest misunderstanding, or the biggest thing I wish I had clarified better in the book, is I think entrepreneurship takes many forms in many different organizations. I think what a lot of people read the book and said, oh, I should go start my own business and fuck these guys I work with. And that wasn't exactly what I was trying to express. That it's a way of viewing the world. The definition I give in the book is entrepreneurs create systems, that they see new possibilities and they seize those possibilities and create new systems around them. And you can do that within organizations. You can do that on your own. There's lots of different organizational structures. You can do it in nonprofits. You can do it in for-profits, right? There's lots of different ways to apply that mindset. And so I think that's the biggest thing that, I emphasize people adopting that mindset is much more important than, the organizational structure in which they are existing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for joining me today, Taylor. So you can check out more of Taylor's work at taylorpearson.me, and you can also find his book on Audible. I downloaded it last week and I've been listening to it. It's a really great book. And then you can also find it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Taylor.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was really fun. Thank you everyone for watching.
Okay, bye everyone.